All right, Internet, welcome back. So this week, we're talking about breadcrumbs, and I spelled it wrong, so we're gonna correct it right now, right in front of you, This is how the sausage is made. Breadcrumbs, one word, not two. So today we're talking about breadcrumbs of cybersecurity, or in other words, not internet, what are you talking about? Indicators of compromise, IOCs. And this little topic was inspired by a book I'm reading, and I should have a summary on this next week because I'm almost done. They call it Applied Network Security Monitoring, and that's like an extension of the previous book I finished, which is The Practice of Network Security Monitoring, I think. And that one's kind of an introductory book. This one's a lot more in-depth, a little bit longer, a lot more detail, but good stuff. So, breadcrumbs, let's talk about that. This is the agenda. I'm talking about what they are, why they matter, and an example in Wannacry. So IOCs, again, is indicators of compromise. So let's break that down. So what is an indicator of compromise? As always, say it backwards, it makes more sense. So it's a compromise. So an attacker has compromised something, and then that compromise has indicators throughout it, basically showing when that and how that compromise happened. So I got an image here of a little beautiful girl following some rocks, and these are the breadcrumbs we're trying to follow. And we have a little magnifying glass here. So an analyst, a forensics, incident response, all these different roles consist of sometimes having to follow the tracks that have been traced from an attacker, because honestly, most attackers are pretty mediocre. And being a mediocre average attacker, when you attack a system or a network, you tend to leave a lot of breadcrumbs behind. And those breadcrumbs can be a variety of things. They could be weird file names, hash values, different directory changes, and a whole bunch of other stuff that I'll explain later. But in a nutshell, indicators of compromise are basically indicators showing that you've been compromised. And that comes from an attacker that's basically rampaged the network and not covered the tracks, and they've left the stuff behind for you to see what's actually happened. So that's kind of a summarization of what it is. Next, we're going to talk a bit about how these are detected. So and I'll explain in the why piece, but the way you can detect an indicator of compromise really two ways, right? So you have the network side and then you have the host side, and I'll explain the host in a second. So the network side is basically the interconnection points between machines and nodes, right? So here I have three examples. There are tons of examples of how this can be detected, but I just pulled out three. And the three I mentioned here are IP addresses. So you can see the two IP addresses connecting and talking to each other. You can see also the kind of the amount of flow flowing between the addresses. You can see the domain names. And you can also see the communication protocols, so the kind of protocols that these individuals are using to communicate across your network, because some protocols are a little more suspicious than others. So host is the same thing as your machine, your computer, right? The host machine. And on here, some other ways you can detect, and on the host side, are file names. So if there's a funky file name, or if there's a weird hash value. So sometimes you can basically take a hash of a file, and then if that hash has changed, when you do a comparison of what's changed, you have an idea of something has gone awry. You might not necessarily know exactly what it was, but you can take those two hash values, compare them, and realize that something's changed. And then the other thing is directory paths. So sometimes when attackers attack a system or a network, they tend to change the directory path for the things that they want to store in there, or their kind of malicious code they want to put in there. It's hot in here, I'm sweating. Oh, London doesn't have air conditioning. Okay. So what are we talking about? So the indicators of compromise I talked about, you can detect these IOCs in two different ways. You can detect them in networks and you can detect them in hosts. Now we're going to talk about how you can break these IOCs down even further. And for me, when learning topics like this, it's always useful to kind of segment and bucket things, because having the topology of a topic makes it a lot easier for me to understand, maybe for you as well. So here there's two different types of IOCs, right? There's a static and there's a variable. A static IOC is something that's known. It's like a file name, an address. You know that these things are malicious. Then you have variables, which are kind of like scenarios. So you're scenario planning for malicious behaviors that haven't happened yet, so you don't have the names and all that stuff, but you have a general idea of what kind of behaviors happen in this malicious action. So these are the unknowns, right? So we'll talk about static first. So static really has three things, right? So the first is atomic, right? So we have atomic IOCs. So an atomic IOC basically is an IOC that can no longer be farther broken down, just like an atom. Well, not really like an atom, because atoms have smaller bits. We can get into a different topic, different video. Anyways, atomic basically means that it can't go down any further, right? So that's like an email address, that's an IP address, and that's other things that aren't separable. The next thing is a computed IOC. So a computed IOC is any IOC that has gone through a process to manifest itself into whatever it is. And an example of that is a hashed value. So if you have a hashed value, it obviously had to go through a hashing algorithm to exist. So that's a computed IOC. And the last one is when you take the atomic and the computed and you slam them together like a planet. And these behavioral IOCs, that's what they're called, behavioral, is a combination of atomic and computed IOCs together. So these are more complex and usually higher level IOCs that take a variety of things together to show you that this kind of combination of things that happen is an IOC. So variables, let me go back. So variables are kind of like an analogy that I found in this book that really resonated a lot was like a movie script, right? So in a movie script, you have a general idea of how the movie is going to evolve over time. And you have the climactic points and all that stuff, but you don't necessarily know who the actors and actresses are gonna be the ones that play the role. And variables are kind of the same. So I have here the Star Wars script, of course. And a variable IOC, like I said, is looking into the future. And an example in the book that was mentioned is, say you have a scenario where an employee receives an email, they open a malicious attachment, that malicious attachment basically downloads some files and code, and then that code gets launched on the computer, which opens up an encryption tunnel that has data exfiltrated throughout that tunnel. So that's a scenario. And in that scenario, you can actually break that scenario down into little pieces, and you can kind of encode those behaviors into your IDS systems to kind of see if there's malicious activity happening for future attacks that don't necessarily have known bad IP addresses and domains, etc. So it's kind of looking into the future. IOCs. So now we're going to talk a bit about the why. So why do we use IOCs? Why do they matter? All that good jazz. Well, they have these things, right? These IDS systems, which are intrusion detection systems. And these systems take these things called signatures. And a signature, really all a signature is basically a manifestation of multiple IOCs into one kind of rule. And this rule basically states, if I see traffic coming from this weird address through this weird port and at a weird time from a weird location, then I should probably monitor that or alert the analyst that some funky stuff's going on, you should check it out. And that's what signatures really do in these IDS systems. So what I've got here is two popular signature-based IDS systems, because there are anomaly-based IDS systems, but these are the signature-based ones. And we basically take all these IOCs, we compile them into a rule, or multiple, usually multiple, so there's hundreds of rules. So you take all these different IOCs and you package them up into signatures, which are then deployed as rules. And that's what makes it relevant for these IDS systems, and that's the why behind IOCs. And the last thing I wanted to show you actually was an example. So a real life situation. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Wannacry, or you've at least seen this screen on the news somewhere. And Wannacry was a famous ransomware attack that basically encrypted a lot of Windows systems and said, give me a bunch of Bitcoin or I'm gonna never give you your data back. And this happened to a lot of individuals. I think it was 200,000 machines were impacted. And there's a map here that shows of all the countries that were impacted. There was over, I think it was 150 countries, 200,000 machines, and I think there was an estimate of a couple billion damage caused by this ransomware attack. And people said that it was North Korea. I'm not sure if that was confirmed or not, but a lot of people say it's North Korea. And what I wanted to show here was some IOCs from the ransomware attack. So as soon as this ransomware attack happened, there was an obvious understanding that this could potentially impact a ton of computers. So a bunch of cybersecurity providers basically pulled different attacks together. They reverse engineered some of the malware, and they pulled out some IOCs and then sent those off to their customers and said, hey, look out for this stuff, put it into your IDS systems, and make sure you're monitoring this at all times. So some of those were, like, we're gonna break it down here so you understand. So the network and host. So remember I said network and host is how you detect. So here I have one interesting one, which was an SMB protocol was being used over port 445. So anytime this happened on the internal network of your system and of your network, as an analyst, if you saw this after this moment happened, there's a chance that this could have been something related to ransomware. So that was one of many IOCs that they would say bundle into your signatures, into your IDS systems, and check for this kind of stuff. It's like kung fu with my hands. So the host side. I have two things here, so file names and hash values. So the file names piece is, here's 3 file names that they said that when ransomware happens, these 3 funky executables get downloaded onto the machine. So look out for these funky executables. So these are static IOCs. Remember how I said static is known? So these are known. And then another thing here is they mentioned all these hash values. On FireEye's website, there was like 40 hash values or something. It was ridiculous. So I just pulled off 5. And remember how I said hash values are basically a hashed change for a file? So checking for these hash file values on the files on your system could associate saying that if these files are in your system and they match this hash value, there's a chance that it's associated with ransomware, so check it out. Last but not least, I wanted to show you a great GIF. And the premise at the end of this chapter in this book, and it makes sense, is that you should always be tuning your signatures and your rules in your IDS system, because these IOCs that we talk about, they're always changing. They're either becoming obsolete, they're too old, or the attacker is figuring out new ways to attack your system, so the IOCs that you have in place are no longer relevant. So, always be tuning your guitar like this. Internet, that's it. That's the show. So I will see you next week, and we should be summarizing the book I mentioned. See ya.